The guy from U.S. Fish and
So for those of you that may not know anything about the National Wildlife Refuge System, I'm briefly tell you a little bit about the organization that I work for.
I will.
Back in 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt established the first National Wildlife Refuge, Pelican Island, in Indian River Lagoon, Indian River County. It was established for protecting the nesting pelicans, herons, and egrets that were found on that island, because at the time there were the feathers were important in the millinery trade. The ladies' hats were adorned with feathers, so it was important to protect those nesting birds from being harvested. Since that time, there's been about 553 national wildlife refuges nationwide, so it is a national network of lands that are managed by the refuge system. Within those refuges, there's about 150 million acres of land that has been protected. And on those lands, we have a very strong public participation as far as visitors coming out to do hunting, fishing, environmental education, and things like that. If you'll notice on this map, you'll see that a lot of the national wildlife refuges are scattered along the east and west coasts of the United States and along the Mississippi River. The reason for this is that the concern in the 1930s and so when a lot of the refuges were established was for migratory birds. And for those of you that hunt waterfowl, every year you're required to purchase a waterfowl duck stamp. The proceeds from that stamp go to purchase lands for migratory waterfowl. Both in the breeding grounds and watering grounds and the migratory areas in between. So a lot of those plains that you see on that map, that's where those refuges came from. So back in 1997, Congress looked at the refuge system and said, we want to give you some marching orders. You're kind of out there on your own. We want to make sure that you know what it is that you're supposed to be managing for. And basically what they said is that, folks, you need to be managing for wildlife, and wildlife comes first. But within that, they said, if there are some opportunities for public use, there are a couple of priority public uses that you need to address and make opportunities to provide for. We'll talk about those in a minute. You're also supposed to manage as a system. So we have a series of policies and procedures that link all of the refuges together so that if you're going to one refuge, a lot of those same things transfer over. So the process that we're doing today involving you, and the same thing we're talking about other refuges throughout the country. The big thing that I'm hoping that everybody's here and is interested for is that whether it's for our agency managing wildlife habitats for our future generations, or it's whether for you interested in preserving hunting opportunities and wildlife areas to airboat with your next generations and your grandchildren's, that's the common ground that we can find together. Because we might have our own special interests, but ultimately I think we're looking and trying to protect and manage the same resources. So what are those priority public uses that the Fish and Wildlife Service, the refuge system, is supposed to manage for? We have a very long tradition of hunting and fishing on national wildlife refuges, and throughout the country we offer many, many opportunities for these activities. We're also involved in activities bringing the public out, the school children, and interpreting and providing environmental educations for public coming out to the national wildlife refuges, as well as providing opportunities for photography. So what is this proposal that we're talking about today? There's two components to the proposal that we're going to be talking about. One is the National Wildlife Refuge itself. It's fee title acquisitions, where we, with a willing seller, and I want to stress this point, that anything we're talking about tonight, whether it's land acquisition or conservation easement, it's all done with a willing seller, so that if you don't have an interest, you don't have to talk to us, and we'll go away. So there's two areas that we're talking about in this proposal is land acquisition, fee title acquisition, where you would just sell your property and all the property rights outright. The other component of this is conservation easements, and we'll talk a little bit about this more in detail later. But that's where we're only purchasing a certain use or interest in the property. So the property itself stays with the existing landowner, but it's only a certain, and in most cases it's just for development rights that we're interested in protecting and preserving. So why is it that we're interested in this landscape that is a part of this proposal? Well, it became very evident to us when we first started looking at this proposal, this study area, that it's part of the headwaters of the Everglades. All the water that is found north of Lake Okeechobee, it all flows down south and down into the Everglades. So we realized that anything that we could do to improve the water quality, quantity, storage capacity north of Lake Okeechobee would improve the water quality in Lake Okeechobee and help the restoration efforts that are occurring down further south. There's many, many species of endangered and threatened species found throughout this landscape, and that's part of our mission as being wildlife first. That's something that we're charged with taking care of, and we're really concerned with some of the species that are found here in this landscape. We're also concerned with climate and demographic change. We know that there's big impacts being felt on our coast. We want to make sure that any of those habitats or any of the species that are found there, they're going to have a place to stay and to migrate to. The other thing is that by the year 2060, it's being proposed or speculated that the population of Florida, currently at 18 million, is going to double to 36 million people. That's a lot of people. They're going to have to go somewhere. And so this landscape that we're looking at currently is blessed with lots of resources, a lot of wild lands. It's really important that we consider how we're going to deal with this influx of people and making sure that there's habitat and places for wildlife to live. We're also blessed with a lot of conservation lands currently on the landscape. But there's also gaps in between, and the Fish and Wildlife Service thinks that they have an opportunity to work with our partners and help fill in some of those gaps. So species like Florida black bear that roam across the peninsula of Florida will have places that are protected throughout the landscape. Obviously, we're interested in recreational opportunities and educational opportunities. But really what drove this project was when we went to this landscape and we saw the stewardship that the ranching community had. It's basically what's allowing us to be talking about protecting and preserving this landscape. And that's a large part of this proposal that we're talking about, is trying to make sure that that landscape is maintained in perpetuity. So how do we arrive at this proposal? Well, we talked to a lot of our partner agencies and organizations, Fish and Wildlife Commission, the Nature Conservancy, South Florida Water Management District. And we realized that there's a lot of people working on the same landscape and had a lot of the same interests. We plotted all those resource values that I just mentioned on a map. And we found that there was basically three areas of really high resource values. There's that area north of Lake Okeechobee, there's an area in the Fish-Eating Creek Basin, and there's another area south of the Caloosahatchee River. And so we drew big, broad boundaries around those. We call them study areas. We didn't know specifically where we wanted to work in that landscape, but we wanted to focus our activities and our energies on those. So we focused on this area north of Lake Okeechobee. We called it the Everglades Headwaters Study Area. And basically what we said, we think there's an opportunity to do 150,000 acres of wildlife conservation in this landscape. About a third of that landscape, we're looking at actually buying the land outright, buying all of the rights for that property and managing it as a National Wildlife Refuge, where we would entertain hunting programs, we'd have visitor centers, our staff would have a place to work, those types of things. But the vast majority, two-thirds of that landscape, would be protected with conservation easements, where we would work with the existing landowners and we'd buy development rights. Because what we're concerned with, and the ranching community and the people that live in this landscape are faced with some very strong concerns about being able to persist on the landscape. So what we're hoping is that we have the ability to purchase the development rights, so we don't see planned communities or shopping malls that are occurring out here in the middle of this landscape. And so the vast majority of this proposal is dealing with existing landowners, keeping them on the landscape, allowing them to continue to make a living, allowing them to allow access, however it's occurring now, and that's a large part of the program. We're also talking with our partners about this project. One of the things that's come up as far as a question, and I'm going to be talking a lot later about some of the questions that have come up in some of our earlier meetings, and this is one of them. It says, does this partnership mean that the service will control partner lands? And emphatically no. We're not looking to go on and assume authority or control or manage any other existing state or federal or non-governmental property. That's not part of this program. So anything that's occurring on those state lands currently, if there's airboat access or if there's hunting programs, that's all going to stay and be maintained just as it is today. That's not part of what we're proposing. As far as the private landowners, they're still going to control whatever access that they're willing to allow on their land. We're not going to be purchasing those types of rights on that property. So this is just an example of some of the folks that we've been talking to, the agencies and organizations that have found some common interests in this proposal, and we're just continuing our conversations with them. I'd like to turn it over to Laura Hausch now to talk a little bit about the planning process.
Thank you. My name is Laura Hausch. I'm a natural resource planner with the Southeast Region of Fish and Wildlife Service. And I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about the process, the planning process. There are two components to this type of planning process. The first is preliminary planning. And what that entails is an internal document is drafted with a proposal. It is sent to the Fish and Wildlife Service Director for approval. If and when the Director approves the proposal, then we can move forward with step 2 of the planning process, which is detailed planning, and we can come to the public and start our public scoping comment period. Part of the detailed planning process, which is step 2, is developing a land protection plan. A land protection plan outlines the resource protection needs and priorities. It identifies the level of protection needed as well as acquisition alternatives. It identifies proposed public uses. It is very important if you want to be on the mailing list. I encourage you to please be on the mailing list because you folks will get a copy of this draft land protection plan, and we will have another public comment period for this draft plan. There will be detailed maps, there will be appendices, so I encourage you to please sign up for this so you can make sure that you can get a copy of it to make comments. All of our planning efforts in the Fish and Wildlife Service go through the National Environmental Policy Act. It is a process that allows us to assess environmental impacts. It allows us to involve the public in decision making. And also we can evaluate a range of alternatives. So where are we now? Right now we're in the public scoping period. We're going to be taking your comments through the end of February, is that correct? Yes. Through the end of February. We hope to have a draft land protection plan by July. We hope to have a final to the director by September of 2011. That's where we are currently. So I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Tamar Hogan. She is the Chief of Realty for the Southeast Region of Fish and Wildlife Service.
Good afternoon. Nice to be here. Glad to see such a big turnout. So I'm going to go over a little bit about the realty processes because, as Charlie mentioned earlier, this is a land acquisition proposal. One of the big questions we're seeing is when can the service acquire an interest in land? We may acquire an interest in land from willing sellers only after our director approves the final land protection plan. So as Laura was mentioning, this public scoping period is gathering comments. We will be working on developing a draft land protection plan, and it will go out for public comment in the summer. And until that is actually finalized and signed off on by our director, it's at that point that we can move forward with identifying landowners and seeking to acquire land. Where can we acquire lands and interests? We can only acquire interest within the boundaries that have been approved by our director, and we call that an approved acquisition boundary. So Charlie's been talking about the 150,000 acre area, the 50,000 fee title land, and then 100,000 conservation easement land. Once that map is drawn, and that's called an approved acquisition boundary, it's only within those areas we can seek to acquire the land. What type of interest in land will we be acquiring? Fee title lands and the conservation easements. What are conservation easements? I think Charlie did go over that a little bit with you, but basically just the easements would limit certain types of uses or prevent development in perpetuity while the land remains in private ownership. The service would be working with individual landowners to meet the needs of the landowners as well as the conservation needs. So what are the advantages of conservation easements? The land remains in the natural state. The private landowner retains ownership, and the needs of both the service and the landowner are met. What is our actual acquisition process? Once we have our approved acquisition boundary identified, we have a staff of about 20 folks in our region that work throughout the Southeast, 10 states, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. On a specific project, how it works is a realty specialist will identify the landowners within that area, send out letters asking for permission to appraise the property. If you fill it out, sign it, send it back, we're going to go ahead and get started ordering an appraisal. We will not do that without your permission. This is, again, a willing seller program. We'll be looking for folks that are interested in participating. They'll send this letter in to us, and we'll order an appraisal. Once the appraisal is contracted, received, we have to get it approved by our Department of Interior review appraiser. Once we can establish just compensation, we'll make a written offer, and at that point, again, you can either sign it or not, and that's kind of the basic process. A lot of folks are interested in understanding the funding. How are we going to fund such a project? For land acquisition, we have general authorities under which we can acquire land. We also have some specific accounts. The Land and Water Conservation Fund is a congressionally appropriated account, so your Congress people are working on your behalf to get money in the budget for specific projects. That's the Land and Water Conservation Fund. We also have the Migratory Bird Conservation Fund, which is a receipt account. It is a congressional account. It's a U.S. Treasury account, but it is the receipts in that account are derived from import duties that are collected on arms and ammunition that are brought into this country, as well as the receipts from the sale of the federal duck stamp. The duck stamp is, most of y'all probably are aware, it's the one that you have to buy in order to mine the federal. And another third source of funding that we use for projects like this, where there are wetlands, is the North American Wetlands Conservation Fund. That's a grant program that the service administers. A lot of folks in the counties are interested in knowing, well, how do they get compensated once those lands are taken off the tax rolls? We had a piece of legislation passed in the early 30s to compensate counties in lieu of taxes. It was the Revenue Sharing Act, and that in rural areas, sometimes these revenue sharing payments may exceed the previous tax payment. And the reason why it's here, we have a very specific guidance on how we calculate those payments. There's three up there, A, B, and C. Wait, you can go back. 0.75% of the market value, 25% of net receipts, or 75 cents per acre. So, for example, the 0.75% of market value, every 5 years we're required to reappraise these properties, and we do it by county. So we look at all the fee title lands within that county, and we apply that formula to it. It doesn't take into consideration any entitlements or any agricultural land use issues. It's a straight payment. So that's why sometimes it is exceeding what was previously collected in taxes. Does the payment remain the same year after year? As I mentioned a second ago, we have to reappraise every 5 years. So every 5 years we're going to get a new amount to calculate our payments on. Where does the money come from to make the payments? We receive income from products or privileges like timber sales, and in the Southeast we have a lot of refuges where we actually do have timber production occurring. We take in grazing fees and right-of permit fees that are all deposited in the National Wildlife Refuge Fund, which is then used to make these county payments. What if there isn't enough money to cover the payments? Well, the Congress is authorized to appropriate money to make up any difference. So we collect in this national account all this money. If it's not enough to cover all the payments, Congress has the authority to appropriate more money to fund that.
What money is that? Taxpayers?
That's the money that we collect on. The Congress would go. They would make a separate appropriation to fully fund the National Wildlife Refuge Fund.
Get it from you. That's right. Taxpayers.
You've already been funding this project for 3 years. would like to fill out a comment card?
We are at a point now. I will be here the rest of the evening. I know a lot of folks will probably have some comments. I'll be here the rest of the evening if you do have specific questions about the land acquisition process. We're a long way from there. Just wanted to be here tonight to answer any concerns you might have. Time for me to turn it over to Charlie and he'll answer or talk about some other common questions.